I cannot tell you all how happy I am to see you here. As most of you know, this conference has been a really long time in the making. And I am so glad that we're able to gather at last, even if only virtually. My name is Katina Rogers. I'm co-director of the Futures Initiative and one of the conference organizers, together with Stacy Hartman, Jihan Takai, and Justin Beauchamp. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from land that is the traditional territory of the Canarsie and Lenape people. I acknowledge the Canarsie and the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land, as well as their continuing relationship with the territory. I invite everybody to share in the chat where you're coming from as well, just your name and where you're from. I'll share a link in case you'd like to learn more about the land that you are currently on as well. I want to say thank you to, again, to everyone who's joining us and also to everyone who's made this conference possible. On an organizational level, this includes the Futures Initiative, the PublicsLab, the Center for the Humanities, the Graduate Center, CUNY, and the Mellon Foundation. We'll have lots more people to thank as the days go on. In just a few moments, CUNY Chancellor Félix Matos Rodríguez and conference co-organizer Justin Beauchamp will offer words of welcome. Before I pass the mic, I want to speak briefly about how the conference came about and why I think it matters. The goals of this conference are really closely connected to ideas that I share in my book, Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, which came out last summer. The premise of that book and of this conference is that talking about career pathways is very important, but that it will never be more than a Band-Aid unless that discussion is embedded in a broader conversation about academic structures, values, and power. With the COVID pandemic, these systemic matters have become even more urgent. We all know that people are struggling right now, but not all in the same ways. Over the past year, we've seen the unequal effects of the pandemic in really painful clarity, the disproportionate impact on already vulnerable communities in terms of illness, job loss, isolation, and more. The crisis goes well beyond matters of health and epidemiology. More than ever, we need people with deep training in the humanities and social sciences engaged in every sector of society, people who understand the historical and social antecedents that created the conditions for where we are today. This is one of the reasons that publicly engaged research matters. And I believe that we can reform graduate education to support such work in structural ways. But unless we collectively address fundamental concerns like the increasing reliance on adjunct labor or the academy's deeply rooted gender bias and racism, deep and lasting change in other areas will be extremely difficult. Today and tomorrow, I hope that we can think not only about where we are, but about where we can imagine going. When I think about the future of higher ed, I want to focus on the possibility of joy and sustainability. But I don't think that you can talk about joy without acknowledging the systems of power that are in place and working to bring about greater justice and equity in those systems. This is also a very timely conversation because colleges and universities are in such a state of upheaval right now, even more than usual. We have a unique opportunity to truly reimagine how educational structures function. So now is the time to redesign the higher education system so that it serves all students and by extension, the public. My hopes for today and tomorrow, I hope that this conference will exemplify openness, generosity, and flexibility, not only in content, but also in structure. This is a conference that is going to show its seams. We know that things may and probably will go wrong. We will roll with it, and we encourage you to do the same. And I also hope that this virtual space will be one of constructive engagement and support, even when we disagree. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce CUNY Chancellor Félix Matos Rodríguez. As Chancellor of the CUNY system since 2019, and throughout his career as an educator and administrator, Dr. Matos Rodríguez has been a tireless advocate for public education and a dedicated champion of accessibility, inclusion, and excellence at CUNY. Please join me in thanking Chancellor Matos Rodríguez for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Katina, for the warm introduction, and congratulations to you and your colleagues on adapting and rearranging the conference. As you mentioned, it was postponed after last year and had to be rescheduled because of the pandemic. And I think we're all learning a thing or two about needing to readapt and our plans. And I also know that the forum was meant somewhat to coincide with the publication of your book. So congratulations on a delayed conference book party. I actually last night was listening to another Graduate Center event on the equity of the recovery, and it was sort of also a delayed book party for Paul Krugman and his book on the, I guess, talking to the zombies. So there seems to be a theme about delaying some of these celebrations of the work that comes in when you put a book together, and then all the things that you hope that book generates in terms of discussion and ideas and change. So the concepts and the urgency of the conference and the notion on how graduate education and the humanities can provide context and insight into what is happening around us has never been more imperative because of the times that we're in. And it might be that it was timely that this conference was delayed, and we're having it now, sort of a year after or so after the pandemic began. As we confront a virus that has ravaged low-income communities and has exposed profound racial and social inequities, the humanities as an academic discipline can provide us with a path towards strengthening our intellectual foundations, expanding our worldview, and comprehending and making sense of the many challenges that we face. Now, more than ever, we need the type of critical thinking and meaningful exchange of ideas that can move us forward and drive equity and inclusion across our rapidly evolving landscape. Thankfully, that kind of engagement has always had a home at CUNY and at the Graduate Center, where the humanities are a linchpin of our educational curriculum, and organizations such as the Futures Initiative, where Katina is a co-director, and PublicsLab empower doctoral students to advance meaningful and equitable change for the public good as scholars, teachers, experts, and leaders. As a historian and a former president of a community college and a four-year college, I have seen firsthand how the humanities can empower our community and strengthen the career prospects of our students. That is why, since I became chancellor a little over 2 years ago, I've made it a priority to embrace humanity-based principles and pedagogies throughout the university as a way to prepare students for the future. Last October, thanks to a $2 million grant from the Mellon Foundation, we announced a faculty initiative that would help the university reimagine humanities instruction in ways that would make it more accessible and practical to students, consistent with CUNY's broad mission of building a more inclusive and equitable society. The result is a program called Transformative Learning in the Humanities, TLH, that aspires to be a national model for preparing students for a world that requires collaboration, creative thinking, and cross-cultural change. The Future Initiatives has been instrumental in developing this program, and I'm pleased that one of the founding members of that program, Kathy Davison, is one of the two faculty members at the helm of the TLH program. This spring, they co-sponsor over 50 workshops and seminars throughout the university for CUNY faculty and students in a variety of humanities-related topics, with the goal of creating a visionary and future humanities curriculum at CUNY that prepares students for success. TLH is also accepting candidates for the first group of Mellon TLH faculty fellows who will participate in peer-to-peer seminars starting in the fall to develop student-centered pedagogical learning practices and research. I want to take this opportunity to thank one of the key champions of this grant, Diane Harris, who's a senior program officer at the Mellon Foundation, and Armando Bencochea. They've been key allies of the Graduate Center, they've been key allies of CUNY in all of this work around pedagogy and the humanities. So thank you for your engagement. I think you might be participating in the conference. One disadvantage of the Zoom is that if we were in a regular theater, you will be able to identify who's here and acknowledge them. So I hope they're out there someplace in one of the Zoom squares that we're all looking at. I also believe that the Associate Provost, Olan from the Graduate Center, and the Dean of Sciences, Joshua Brumberg, are also with us. So I want to give them a shout out and to the leadership of the Graduate Center for the work that they have done. Another shout out to the conference organizers who've made so much, put so much work into making this conference be ready for success. And Justin Beauchamp and Sihan Tekai, congratulations for all the hard work that you've done. I also understand that the former president and provost of the Graduate Center, my good friend Joy Connolly, is in the audience. So now the president of the ACLs. So great to have you, Joy, with us also. I also want to thank the plenary speakers and all the participants in the different conferences that will be lending their insights into the conference, and they will share their work and create collaborative work together as we go through the conference. I will close by saying that I hope everyone in attendance is inspired and encouraged by the discussion and the ideas put forth over the next 2 days. And that please know that at CUNY we will continue to emphasize the humanities across our campuses, since the humanities foster equity and innovation and bolster the university's mission in so many important ways. And we'll take the ideas, the feedback, the critique that comes from how to build a more inclusive university, a more equitable university, how to dig deep into our own practices and see what change can occur, and put it into practice in our day-to-day work across our 25 campuses and our entire system. And so I hope to be able to pick in and listen to some of the speakers. And I hope you have a really, really great and successful conference. And I appreciate the invitation to speak to you. And also when you have shared your work with me, it has helped me in my different roles at CUNY. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Matos Rodríguez, for your remarks and also for emphasizing the timeliness and importance of this kind of work. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you might be in the world. My name is Justin Beauchamp, welcoming all pronouns. I'm the college assistant for the PublicsLab and one of the co-organizers, as Katina mentioned earlier. I'm also a second-year PhD student in the sociology program here at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm speaking to you all today from unceded Lenape and Canarsie land on what is today referred to as Queens. I echo Katina's earlier sentiments about honoring the indigenous peoples whose lands we now occupy, and I invite everyone to join us in considering how these histories and futures shape how we live, work, educate, and research, not only throughout this conference, but in how we carry this work forward. Particularly as we convene to discuss how graduate education, quote, works in the world, I think it's crucial we constantly examine our positionality, context, community impact, and the systems of power and privilege in which we operate. For example, a few folks who wanted to attend are unable to join us today because of the situation in Texas. We are thinking about them and all of our friends, family, and colleagues who are impacted by this disaster. We acknowledge that as researchers, teachers, students, practitioners, and even as activists, that we're all socially situated and cannot separate ourselves from these and from other events. So as we get started with this conference, we encourage everyone to consider some community guidelines for our time together. First, we'll be in this Zoom room for all of today, so the link is the same should you need to hop off or get disconnected for any reason. Our session moderators and technology folks will have brackets after their names indicating their role. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, either in the chat publicly or via private message should you need anything throughout the conference. Since we are such a large group, we ask that folks remain on mute unless you're speaking. If you would like to consult the schedule at any point for this afternoon's lightning talk topics or for tomorrow's sessions, my colleague Jihan will drop the link to the program into the chat shortly. Tomorrow's discussion sessions are open to everyone. Due to the overwhelming interest in this conference, we adjusted these sessions slightly so that we can utilize 2 separate Zoom links to allow for breakout rooms in each of those sessions separately to allow for smaller discussion. So today's link will be used for discussions A, C, and E, and the social hour tomorrow. And the second link will be used for discussions B, D, and F. Don't worry, we'll make sure to remind everyone at the end of today, and we'll also send an email reminder out tomorrow morning with the correct links for the sessions that you might be interested in attending. Throughout these 2 days, we highly encourage your active participation. Please share your thoughts, questions, your comments, your feedback in the chat. Please use the Zoom reactions and can also contribute to our collaborative notes. We'll be using Open Google Docs to simultaneously and collaboratively take notes and reflect on each session. So Jihan will also drop that link for this particular plenary session into the chat shortly for you all to contribute to those collaborative notes. When we get to Q&A portions of sessions or open discussion, please raise your hand using the Zoom feature in the Participants tab. The moderator of each session will call on folks in the order that they've identified their desire to speak, while also prioritizing hearing from people who haven't yet spoken. So please be mindful of the space and time that you take up so that others may contribute as well. Some may consider this the step up and step back approach. We all know that Zoom is tiring, so we have built in frequent breaks. The Zoom room will stay open during the breaks. You are welcome to keep using the chat during that time, though we ask you to turn off your mics and cameras during those breaks. If any of you use Twitter, we'll be utilizing the hashtag #GradAtWork. So please join in on the conversation if you feel so moved. And lastly, as Katina mentioned, we'll be learning together. So she mentioned 3 key guiding principles: openness, generosity, and flexibility. We're hoping to provide a space where we can collectively learn with and from one another, and certainly welcome your feedback as we move along these next 2 days. So with all of that, we now move into our plenary session where our presenters will be discussing their work, which exemplifies innovation in graduate education at work in the world through a collaborative public-facing project implemented by the University of Michigan and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're extremely excited that joining us today are Dr. Rita Chin, Professor of History and Associate Dean of Social Sciences for the Rackham Graduate School at the University of Michigan, Dr. Jay Cook, Professor of History and Department Chair at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Leah Wolfson, the Rosalyn Unger Director of Campus Outreach for National Academic Programs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So please join us in a virtual round of applause for our plenary session presenters for their talk, History Lab, a Blueprint for Humanities at Work in the World. Drs. Chin, Cook, and Wolfson, welcome.
Thank you, Justin, and greetings to everyone from snowy Ann Arbor, Michigan. I too want to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is on traditional Anishinaabe land in Ann Arbor and in our state. Thank you, Justin, for the very kind introduction. We are really delighted and honored to be a part of this conference. And thank you to Katina and all of your CUNY colleagues for this wonderful opportunity to share some ideas and models that we've developed at Michigan over the past 3 years. We really appreciate it, and we're huge fans and admirers of the Futures Institute, so delighted to be here on many levels. We should start, there we go, our first slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so what follows here is a kind of Rashomon presentation with 3 different versions braided together of the same creation story. One from the perspective of the History Lab instructor, Rita Chin, one from the institutional partner, Leah Wolfson, and one from the department chair, Jay Cook. Our common object of analysis is an experimental History Lab program that we developed at the University of Michigan in 2018 as a kind of blueprint for collaborative humanities scholarship at work in the world, to borrow this important and useful phrase. Our talk is divided into 4 parts. We begin with our respective challenges in the process of building the partnership itself, and then we turn to the work of implementation, as well as some of the collective lessons that we've learned so far. Next slide, please.
So there you see the partners. Next slide, please. We wanted to begin with the challenges. From my perspective, initially that of the would-be course instructor, the main challenge was really how to teach students to collaborate in a discipline, that is history, which emphasizes and valorizes solitary research and writing, and that largely expects single-authored articles and books as its primary products of scholarship. For me, the idea that we should be teaching in any other way really only became an issue when I became graduate director for the history department, so director of graduate studies. And in my role as DGS, I participated in the American Historical Association's work on career diversity. Through the AHA, I became convinced of our need to broaden career horizons for our students, and was introduced to 5 transferable skills that the association had identified as crucial for doctoral student success, both within and beyond the academy. Those skills are communication in multiple modes and to a variety of audiences, collaboration with others, intellectual self-confidence or the ability to work beyond subject matter expertise, digital literacy, and quantitative literacy. Now, setting aside quantitative literacy, it seemed to me that collaboration was the core skill that we in history didn't really teach our students at all. So I enlisted a colleague of mine, Jeff Weidlinger, and we began to brainstorm how we might design a research-based course that would focus on team projects in order to give students a hands-on experience with collaboration. Next slide.
So my own challenges as chair of the history department began with the recurring talk track. I suspect everyone on this Zoom feed will be familiar with the kinds of conversations I have in mind here. Questions from students and parents asking about the utility and the cash value of our modes of training. Questions from deans and provosts about how to address the shrinking numbers of jobs in undergraduate majors. Metrics which of course tend to map on to decisions about graduate admissions, funding packages, and cohort sizes. I was also increasingly weary of hearing the same well-intentioned responses from my colleagues. Above all, that we at the University of Michigan History Department train our students to do original research, to write well, to think critically and cultivate empathy through our work. Now, I certainly believe all of those things to be absolutely true and have often argued for them passionately. Still, I felt some growing frustration with the terms of discourse itself, which always seemed to place humanists on the back foot, so to speak, answering recurring narratives of decline and statistics that seemed to prove our lack of value beyond the academy. Or to put it another way, I was tired of defending abstractions like good writing or critical thinking as my primary forms of rebuttal. I was weary of those dinner conversations, you may know them well, in which we complained about the scientists and the engineers who did not properly get what we do or didn't understand the critical power of our methodologies. Meanwhile, these same scientists and engineers were busy building smartphones and curing diseases. And in any case, they didn't seem to care much about our critiques. Finally, I was weary of pedagogical blueprints for graduate teaching that remained virtually unchanged from those we had been using in our seminars for close to a century. Instead of doubling down on these older models, I was eager to launch a more affirmative set of arguments for the power and efficacy of our work, arguments that actually demonstrated that work in action, at work in the world, serving actual publics. Above all, I wanted to do more concrete showing of our contributions in multiple contexts, as opposed to relying on abstractions that even our most brilliant and dedicated students often experienced as difficult in explaining to their families and partners. Next slide, please.
So my challenge as the institutional partner at the museum was in many ways the most straightforward. USHMM had a project that needed content. Experiencing History, Holocaust Sources and Context, as you see some screenshots here, is the museum's primary source tool for the college classroom. It launched in 2017 and to date has attracted over 45,000 users in 800 unique institutions, many courses, 46 states, 30 countries, and 38 disciplines. And the project features carefully selected, translated, contextualized primary sources on a host of different topics related to the Holocaust. Next slide, please. So these primary sources are grouped into larger thematic sections, as you see here, and brought together by a common theme or a collection. These collections include about an 800-word essay with citations and secondary sources on a given topic like this one, which is one of the collections that the second cohort of University of Michigan students created on American college students and the Nazi threat. Next slide, please. And then within the collection itself, we feature a variety of primary sources, whether that's diaries, posters, letters, film footage, testimonies, and more, which come with a short essay contextualizing them as a source, and then as part of the larger historical or cultural narrative of the time. We also translate and annotate sources as needed. So for a single content creator to produce a collection would take 6 to 9 months of full-time work. And at the time that University of Michigan approached us about a possible partnership, we did not have a dedicated content creator on staff to do that work. Next slide, please.
So from the course instructor perspective, the partnership with the Holocaust Museum was really our solution to what we saw as a central dilemma of team-based courses. Namely, how to identify projects that students would want to work on collectively. In history, at least, students tend to gravitate toward topics and projects that match their subject area expertise. So when my co-instructor and I were grappling with this issue of how to develop projects that students would really want to be invested in, it occurred to us that we could take the question of perfectly aligned topics and expertise out of our hands and out of the hands of students by partnering with a client that had a project for the class to work on. So my co-instructor, Jeff Weidlinger, had deep connections with the Holocaust Museum and suggested that we approach them with our course idea. And when we learned about the museum's Experiencing History digital tool, the partnership seemed really ideal. Next slide, please.
So what stood out?
Sorry.
That's okay. So what stood out to the museum was really how seriously University of Michigan was taking the course and the partnership from the moment that they approached us. The fact that this was going to be a course on the books mattered. The fact that it fulfilled a department requirement mattered. The fact that Rita and Jeff understood that I too, as the project lead, had to propose this up to our stakeholder committee for approval, and they quickly crafted a proposal to work with us mattered. So in other words, we all recognized each other's labor and effort and time. And we also immediately recognized the investment that everyone was making in the students as well as in the success of the project. And we also recognized that this was an experiment for all concerned, and we knew we would be iterating along the way. So we were really partners from the very beginning in every sense of the term. And that spirit of collaboration, which you'll hear from us a lot today, really continued all the way through the project, from the pre-meetings at the museum to the participation in the actual class itself and the parts we each played within it. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jay.
At the departmental level, we began with 4 bedrock principles, and we talked about these for about a year in 2017-18 in a pair of task forces on career diversity and public engagement. First, rather than imposing these reforms from on high in a kind of top-down way, we would try to build groundswells of participation from below, enlisting clusters of energized faculty and graduate students eager to work together on collaborative projects. The compelling projects themselves, we hoped, would expand the circle of we across our very large department. Second, we would try to design our labs in ways to make them welcoming to students across every period, geographic area, and subfield, not just modernists, not just Americanists or Europeanists, and not just those who already did important work on issues related to public policy. Third, We would design these labs to cultivate transferable skills of concrete value for any humanities PhD student. The hope was to collapse the older Plan A versus Plan B zero-sum choices by cultivating professional skills useful in all directions, regardless of professional trajectory. Finally, we would try to position our larger lab program squarely in the public service. In some cases, this meant working with world-renowned partners like the US Holocaust Museum or the Detroit Institute of Arts. But we've also built recent labs with community groups in Detroit, K-12 teachers across our state, and asylum lawyers working to support undocumented migrants to Southeast Michigan. Most recently, we started a partnership with our flagship organization, the American Historical Association, with whom we're now doing a collaborative research project on the racialized history of our own discipline. While some of our faculty were initially uneasy about possible changes to their teaching methods, and you know the kinds of responses, not again, you're not going to tell me how to teach differently, for the third time in a decade. But what we discovered was that virtually everyone in our community understood the broader value of these public-facing projects. So that's where we began. Next slide, please.
So then as we get into the meat of what did the students actually do, they really did everything that any content creator, be they USHMM staff or outside scholar, would normally do for us. So rather than read off the tasks that you can see here enumerated on this slide, I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of the unseen parts of these efforts and give you kind of a little bit of under the hood of the car approach. And the first thing I want to point out is the expedited timetable that we were working on. This was, after all, a course that was bounded by the semester. And while we gave students a short paragraph that outlined the broad topic that we wanted them to cover, like American college students and the Nazi threat, they then had to create a fleshed out proposal that outlined their approach, their learning objectives, the periodization they wanted to use, the types of sources and representation that they wanted. And they presented this to our stakeholder group on week 3. That's very different from having an entire semester to produce a paper. The next thing I wanted to unpack is the collection's presentation itself. Our stakeholder group consists of a lot of different people from a lot of different perspectives. It's our director of applied research. It's our director of national academic programs, our director of educational initiatives, our director of museum experience and digital media. So when the students presented their work, and they did so twice, once virtually and then once in person at the museum, which the museum was able to fund, they had to frame their ideas differently than a conference paper or the presentation of an argument. And they received a wide variety of feedback that they then had to sift through. And finally, embedded in the choice of sources and the act of drafting them is an awareness of how our audience, college students from a variety of disciplines and potential courses and institutions, as well as an awareness of the voice of the museum. Having a really neat source you loved was not enough. It had to have a compelling reason to be featured, a connection to other sources on site, and a way that it would speak to that core audience. A source write-up was not about an original argument. It was about the questions that were raised that reached beyond one discipline or one type of course context. And in order to get there, the students received a lot of feedback, a lot of conversation, and a lot of editing. Next slide, please.
And I'll just add that that feedback meant that they were really engaged in something that was very different from a single authored paper. So I just want to talk a little bit about the week-to-week experience of the course and the ways that collaboration was sort of built in at multiple levels. So the class was divided into 2 teams, and each team had 3 to 4 students on it. And within the teams, students were divided up and were responsible for individual tasks, which they worked on sort of outside of the classroom. But then during weekly class meetings, faculty and students together searched databases, we analyzed sources, we critiqued write-ups. And then, as Leah mentioned, at regular intervals, the class presented their work to museum stakeholders and partners for collective discussion. So they did stakeholder presentations twice, but we were also in constant dialogue with Leah and her team, back and forth on the principles of the collection, on the different sources and their strengths and weaknesses, and then strategies for presenting to the stakeholders. So this collaborative experience really had the effect of flattening the traditional hierarchy between faculty and students. Really, everyone in the class provided feedback. So both Jeff Feidlinger and I were there on the ground every week. You can see us here in this image talking to Leah and her team on the video screen. So we were doing video conferencing before it became de rigueur because of the pandemic. But it really did have this interesting flattening effect on the hierarchies. Everyone participated, but ultimately it was really the museum partners that made the final call on whether a document write-up or a collection description was acceptable to the museum. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you some of the student responses to the course. And we taught this course in consecutive years in what Michigan calls the winter semester of 2019, and then again in winter 2020. And so we collected a lot of feedback from the students. I don't want to read the quotes to you, but I do want to just highlight some of the kind of takeaways from the student voices. So here you can see that the student really valued learning how to search for and evaluate primary sources, how to communicate through public history to non-academic audiences. Next slide, please. Another student here expressed surprise at the complications that were introduced by working with other people, and noted that they were not subject area experts in Holocaust studies, right? But even though they were not taking a course that was in their subject area expertise, they learned many valuable skills for their future career. Next slide, please. And then another student really expressed excitement at developing a tool that would actually be used, right? Used by undergraduates, and that served as a concrete thing in the world that could be shown to prospective employers, to fellow students. And one student even joked that this was something that he could show to his grandmother. Next slide, please.
So for our department, this process of implementation quickly led to a series of related questions regarding size, frequency, and fit. Really basic stuff like how many students and faculty per lab? How many labs should we offer each year? And what about subfield expertise? Should a lab like this one be restricted to faculty and PhD students working specifically on questions like fascism, genocide, and/or Central and Eastern Europe? Our answers so far are as follows. Thus far, we found that roughly 6 to 12 PhD students, generally divided into teams of 3 or 4, is a pretty good place to start. We found that a pair of faculty, team teaching, often from different fields, helps to lower the expectation of specialized expertise and accelerates a sense of wider inclusion across our larger curriculum. Team teaching has also helped us to make these labs more sustainable over time so that each project does not simply belong to a single faculty person who may be going on leave or need to teach another kind of course. As far as possible, we've tried to build these labs around an open architecture. In other words, one that could be tweaked, reimagined, reinflected for many different kinds of collaborative projects. The only non-negotiable goals we've tried to maintain are the focus on collaboration driven by a project, the orientation to broader publics, and the fungible skills that Rita mentioned above, those 5 core skills that the AHA developed. Finally, we've tried to implement our labs in ways that would create good synergies with our components, with our other components of our public engagement and career diversity initiatives. In practice, this means focusing less on subfield coverage than promoting transferable skills we want every student in our large PhD program to develop through the course of their training. We now think of our PhD internships, our digital humanities projects, and our lab courses as fully interlocking components of a broader training program, because all of these different pieces productively bolster those core skills that Rita outlined above. Next slide, please.
So we've now talked about challenges, building the partnership, and the implementation of the course. So we want to talk now about lessons learned. For me, as the course instructor, I started the process by wanting to teach what was for me a new skill, right? And it actually involved collaboration with a colleague to develop the course and collaboration with the Holocaust Museum. But one of the things that surprised me going through the process of teaching this course was that I came to see that we were also teaching students how to work within the discipline of history in a rigorous way. So that we were teaching fundamental skills and ironically skills that students had been asking for many, many years. They would say to us, we wish that faculty would take us into the archives. We wish that faculty would teach us how to do research. And those, it turns out, were precisely the skills that we were building in this collaborative course, right? So how to define a research topic, how to assess sources and documents for an argument. In short, we were teaching the nuts and bolts of how to conduct historical research. So if the original goal for me had been to help students succeed beyond the academy, I realized that the course was also helping students master more traditional academic skills. So it was doing both at the same time. Two other quick points. My focus had been on collaboration, as I've said, but the client relationship that we developed with the Holocaust Museum also helped us teach a number of the other AHA 5 skills, communicating to multiple kinds of audiences, both in terms of the digital tool itself, which was aimed toward college-age students, but also to the museum stakeholders. Really helped students develop intellectual self-confidence. A number of the students were not experts in Holocaust studies, right? And so they really learned that they could put their knowledge of research to work and critical analysis and writing to work in ways that didn't depend on having full expertise in Holocaust studies. And also we were teaching them some about digital literacy. The second point I wanted to make was the department didn't have to upend its entire graduate curriculum to offer these important additional skills, right? This was one course, and it was a course that counted toward an existing requirement, but it was a really transformative course for the department, but didn't actually require a kind of taking apart of the entire curriculum to begin the process of embedding transferable skills into the way we train graduate students.
So from the museum's perspective, we took away several things. One was kind of something very tactical. This was a real exercise for us in collaboration as well. So we learned that content production in teams results in a better product. And that's something that we've carried through in the Experiencing History product and also really across other projects at the museum, is thinking about content creators working together. That wasn't something we had previously baked into the workflow. But just as importantly, and maybe even more important for the group convening here today, is that this partnership convinced other museum stakeholders, not only those associated with this project, but more broadly across the institution, to really consider graduate students in serious ways as potential co-collaborators. And I would even extend that beyond graduate students to think about our audiences as co-collaborators with us, whether that's on an educational product like Experiencing History, or whether it's looking to a course or a group of folks about creating data visualizations from our Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos project, or other initiatives across the institution. And in fact, a partnership like this one for this project, for Experiencing History, is now a regular part of my budget. And that was not a given walking in the first time around. So the fact that this is now just a part of what we do, or is becoming a part of what we do, is a really important outcome. And then I would say this also has an outcome in terms of outreach and in terms of the goals of experiencing history, the goals of the tool itself, and the goals of campus outreach. The students who worked on this project started using it and recommending it. So students were then teaching with the very material that they helped to create. And that's really exciting to see. We run all kinds of metrics on the site in terms of who's using what when, and this past fall, Ann Arbor was one of our highest performing sites for fall of 2020. And these students served as really wonderful boosters and recommenders of the site to their colleagues and friends across all different types of disciplines and contexts. So all of that together was really a success for us.
So in terms of lessons learned for the department, let me start with good news. Our student testimonials, as you've heard, have been very positive thus far. For many of these lab projects, we've had wait lists for students, and they've tended to be more diverse pools of students than our other regular history classes. Our national organization, the AHA, has supported and applauded our efforts at every turn. We're very lucky to have that support from our national organization. And over the past 3 years, we've seen many of the students from these pilots go on to do amazing work in a wide range of professional sectors. All told, we're now up to 13 different labs in our department, which feels like a pretty big win in the course of 3 short years. And unlike interim PhD internships, which we've also pursued, running lab courses like this, we found, is relatively inexpensive. The only real cost is a modest lab development fund that we started, which we now deploy as an added summer funding stream for our PhD students. But that said, I wanted to end on a note of pragmatism and full transparency, sharing some of the tough and lingering challenges we're currently working through as a department. One of these involves our PhD requirements, which is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of our collective investments. At present, we're gearing up for some important program-wide conversations on questions like, should a lab course like this count as fully equivalent to a more traditional seminar in which students develop research papers? It's one thing, after all, for our faculty to endorse labs as an innovative add-on to an existing curriculum or rubric, but quite another to now define them as a core requirement. What we did at first was just offered this as a parallel possibility next to our traditional research seminars, but now we're thinking seriously about whether every student in our program should be taking a lab or two. We've also noticed that some of our faculty mentors have responded to the difficult job markets by wanting to double down on traditional forms of subfield expertise for their students. In other words, in the face of hyper competition for fewer jobs, they want their students to engage in more specialized training, write more single-authored essays targeted for other experts in the subfield. The intentions here are good. They're often supportive. They want their students to get that 1 or 2 good jobs in modern French history, that'll surface in the fall. In the bigger picture, though, the structural logics for prioritizing more specialized training seem pretty dubious to me. So we're still kind of working through that culture change in helping people to let go of more specialized expertise as opposed to the kind of open architecture that we've been describing today. Finally, we've learned that the startup work for building successful collaborations can be lengthy, sometimes extending over a full year or two developing these kinds of partnerships. In practice, this means that we generally try to find institutional partners who will support our labs and work with us over at least 2 or 3 different iterations, with multiple cohorts of faculty and students moving through the same lab project over an extended period of time. Otherwise, it can be difficult to maintain a robust set of offerings as these lab projects come and go. But as you know, it's difficult for departments to be agile and flexible, and institutional partners don't think in terms of academic calendars or worry much about faculty having the ability to repeat a course 2 or 3 or 4 times. So these are the kinds of things that we continue to work on and talk through at the departmental level.
Next slide. So then I think what we wanted to leave with is we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for discussion. And we've given a couple of conversation starters, but I already see that there's a very, very robust discussion already going on there in the chat. So I defer to our moderators to go ahead and kick us off with this, but we had posed some questions from our perspectives of the administrator, the institutional partner, and the department chair that are around the question of graduate schools supporting this type of innovation from the partner perspective, since this is now something that we are very invested in doing. We happen to have a really wonderful connection through Jeff Eidlinger at University of Michigan, but we are always looking to reach beyond those with whom we have a robust connection. So what might that look like? And then from the departmental standpoint, how is this sustainable? How is this scaled up? How does this move beyond the people we know from any perspective and into something that becomes just an organic part of each of our programs? So we'll stop here and we'll defer to our friendly moderators to get the Q&A started.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for this presentation and for our upcoming discussion. So I want to be able to give the floor if they desire to, I believe it's, and I apologize if I am saying your name incorrectly, but Sindiha Franzetti asked about applications of this work towards undergraduate populations. So if you'd like to elaborate on that question, no pressure to, but if other folks had thoughts on that.
I think I could speak for our own departments. We've really tried to develop this across both our undergraduate and graduate curricula. And we found that the open architecture blueprint has worked equally well in both contexts. We've run some recent undergraduate history labs on the history of racial profiling in the city of Detroit from the civil rights era to the present. There's a digital mapping project designed to provide community resources to neighborhood organizations and the municipal government in Detroit. The lab project I referenced earlier with asylum lawyers was also an undergraduate project working with an asylum lawyer clinic in southeastern Michigan to help undocumented migrants from Latin America, kind of filling out the histories, thinking about different issues with around gender or children, and providing that kind of research and differentiated set of experiences to help asylum lawyers make those claims as powerfully as they can. And our undergraduate students have found this, really to be a transformative experience to get to participate in those projects. So at least in our experience, it's worked very well at the undergraduate level too.
All right, so I'm going to jump to a hand raise, David Petrain, and then we can get back to some of the questions in the chat.
Oh, hi, thank you, Justin. I just wanted to thank the three of you for this wonderful, really interesting presentation. I have a question that I think is specifically for Rita and Jay. Has this success with organizing collaborative work for your students made you rethink any of the exit requirements for your program? That is to say, what you ask students to do either in general exams or for their dissertations?
I think I'll let you handle that one, Jay.
I think, these are the big open questions that we're working through right now. And initially, it's relatively easy to launch pilots, do 2 or 3 of them, kind of bask in the good feeling of very strong student feedback and faculty feedback. Where it starts to get trickier for us, we're a very large department. We're the largest history department in the United States, and we're very proud of the fact that we're really global and cover all fields, all time periods, geographic regions. And so things get more complicated when we start talking to pre-modernists who are doing specialized kind of work, for example, with papyri, in ancient fields, or fields that have very specialized forms of training around, using certain kinds of documents, training their graduate students to read scripts, or, to work with non-Anglophone materials. And that's where things get complicated when we start to imagine, should every student going through our program be participating in these different kinds of labs that we're developing? If so, how do we create a kind of spectrum of projects that will really represent who we are as a department that is proudly global, transnational, cosmopolitan, and has tried very hard to kind of deprovincialize, Western US, European history. And as I think many of you will probably recognize, some of these projects often bubble up fastest from faculty who are working on policy questions around racial justice in the United States, or around things that can connect to think tanks or policy centers in Washington. But we've made a big effort to try not to skew asymmetrically, right, to those fields alone, to really make this a broader part of who we are and what we do as a PhD program. And so we're still kind of working through what that looks like if we want every student in our program to do it and to participate.
So David, if I could just chime in a little bit to say that, sort of wearing the hat of the DGS and somebody who was in charge of the graduate program, and somebody who through my work with the AHA became convinced that the department really needed to do work in this area and take these issues seriously. I guess the strategy was really to try to do low-hanging fruit, which was the thing that I can control is I can develop a course, right? And the hope is that it's a successful course. It's a course that gets students excited, that gets not only students in the program excited, but prospective students excited, and that will also begin to shift the way that faculty think about this kind of work. So I think that's where we started. And I think that there has been tremendous resonance with the students, who virtually every single one of them who has taken the course has felt like they have gotten so much more than they expected to get out of it. And now we are starting to have the conversations about where the rubber hits the road. If it was up to me, I would say that this kind of course ought to actually be a requirement in our first year, because it is doing the very things that students have asked us to do for so long, which is teach them, walk them through the process of doing archival research. And it really helps to be able to do that as a kind of common project or common set of projects. But that's kind of an open question about whether that will actually happen.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So I know there were a couple questions in the chat from Lisette and Maggie, potentially one or two others. If you wanted to elaborate with any of your questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. So we'll jump now to Mary Chapman. Oh, Mary, we have you on mute.
This is all very inspiring. Thank you so much. I had a question that was about assessment. I'm wondering, when, in the classes I've taught like this, sometimes there's a real variety of achievement in what the students prepare. So I wondered, does the museum kind of kill some of the descriptions or writing? How are students assessed, and what do you do with poor contributions?
Rita, do you want me to take that first, or do you want to do it?
You go for it, Leah.
Okay. So, you know, for us, this was not an exercise. For us, this was playing with fire. Like we wanted, this is it is certainly one way of getting content for the site, but it is a very labor intensive way of getting material for the site. So from our standpoint, we really needed this to be news we could use. I think what we did is we have a content manager on staff who would be kind of like the first line. The students would work together. They would then work with Rita and Jeff. It would then land in we had a shared drive, just from a functional standpoint. It would land in our shared drive. Our content manager would kind of do round one, which was his kind of bucket of suggestions, and he would send it back. And then they would have a chance to essentially, you know, for lack of a better term, kind of revise and resubmit. And I think we did one round of that so that we wouldn't be in this constant ping, 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 back and forth, because that doesn't serve anybody. So once it came back to us a second time, as far as we were concerned, it was ours. And then our content manager did what he does with it. And sometimes that was, the student rewrite was enough, sometimes it wasn't. But that was labor that largely took place that was on our side at that point. That did not have much to do with the course itself. We did have kind of interesting exercise where we sent the students out into the world, so to speak, to actually get undergraduate students to read one of their introductory texts. And we have a pre-existing survey that the museum's developed that literally has them rank it on this is clear or confusing, is this valuable or unhelpful, tell us what you think this essay is about, and tell us what you think the most important thing is, which is oftentimes a sobering moment. To actually look at that and see what, like, wow, that's not what I thought I wrote. And that became a kind of piece of feedback as well. But we did not get involved in the grading of it. That was on Rita and Jeff's plate. So Rita, I don't know if you want to pick up with anything about your actual grading.
Well, I was just going to add a little bit to the process because when the students and the teams would submit work to the museum and get that first round of feedback, the instructors were often in those documents too, writing alongside of the students, right? And so that's where I mean, so in our class discussions, there was a kind of collapse in the hierarchy between faculty and student, but also in the actual production of these descriptions, right? So Jeff and I were in there, we were editing, students, you know, and we were using basically Google Docs, right? And so everybody was part of that process. But then, as Leah said, in the end, it was really the museum's decision, right? And there were some document descriptions that didn't make the final cut, right? That didn't make it into the collections that now exist as, you know, live digital tool on the museum site. So those decisions were all made by the museum. Our grading process was really in terms of the collaboration, right? Because there was no single author, right? So the museum has a portion of the digital tool that lists all of the people who contributed, and all of our names are there. But, you know, in the kind of spirit of this being a collaborative set of projects, we didn't grade on sort of the success of the writing, as it were, as much as the collaborative process.
Thank you.
Great. Katina, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I really love learning from people who have put these things into action. You know, I mean, it's so great to hear concrete examples of what's been working and also what you've learned. One thing that I've been seeing in the chat and that is connected to a question that I have is some of the broader impacts that you might be seeing from starting to develop and scale up these labs. Part of that, people have been asking in the chat about, you know, impacts for the students themselves, which I'm curious about. I'm also curious about, I don't know, maybe research impacts. Is it changing? Are you seeing any changes in the projects that faculty members are undertaking, or in the kinds of things, maybe it's too soon, but the kinds of things that people are bringing forward in their tenure portfolios? Are you seeing any impacts so far in the kinds of students who are drawn to the program in the first place, and in admissions, that kind of thing? What are you noticing in terms of like effects that radiate outwards from the specific lab courses and the partnerships?
Well, let me just do the student part, and then Jay, you could do some of the departmental sort of tenure and promotion stuff. For the students, I think that I mean, all of them talk about learning how to write more clearly, right? That they began to see that those kinds of convoluted sentences that people often write in graduate school are actually not very effective. Some of our students who tended to be more theory heavy learned to explain their ideas and their thought processes in much clearer language. And they talk about it as affecting not only the remaining seminars that they were doing if they were taking it as an early graduate student in our program, but we also had some students who were more advanced talk about how it was really impacting the ways that they were writing their dissertation. And then also thinking about audiences for their dissertation. Jay?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I think so far, with the sample size from the last 3 years, we've got a number of answers. I think for a number of students who I know personally, we've seen some of the same kinds of effects that Rita was talking about. Students who had previously struggled at times with writing and long form arguments in very technical, insular debates in their subfields around methodology, having participated in these kinds of projects and also in other things like, our podcast program, which is entirely student produced, edited, authored. People are coming out of these programs much more daring and much more interesting in terms of their narrative strategies. They're writing in ways that are really wonderful to see, elegant, creative, kind of freed from the pressures of academic expertise. I think we've also seen that a number of our faculty are starting to imagine projects that map onto this architecture in ways that are really exciting. I have a colleague, assistant professor, colleague Jennifer Jones, who's an African-American woman, grew up in a Rust Belt town in Lower Michigan, who's developing a kind of oral history project around the Great Migration in the I-94 corridor between Detroit and Chicago, looking at these Rust Belt towns similar to the one she grew up in. And this kind of collaborative project where you can have teams of students doing different towns in a kind of comparative way to create this wide angle, kind of macro story about a larger process like the Great Migration to the state of Michigan. This model unfolds and opens up these possibilities that would be much harder, right, for a single scholar working with maybe a single graduate student or two. The other positive thing I've seen, which is very exciting, is that the sheer volume of these projects is exerting pressure up the ladder to our college. And so I've been participating recently in chairs and directors meetings of the humanities division, where after years of asking for revisions to promotion standards, it's happening, it's now. And that's really kind of gratifying to see, and to see that we're taking it seriously, not just in terms of rewarding people's CVs, but also, redefining the metrics by which we promote people, and talk about impact, resonance, productivity, etc.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right, so we have Lisette. I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for these presentations. And I really appreciated Katina's question, and I wanted to kind of just follow up because, I mean, listening to this, it sounds like, it's very clear all of the positive effects that this has from the student's perspective, like all of the skills that are gained. And as someone who works or tries to do at least some public facing work in my classes, I've seen that firsthand. So it's just fantastic to see this work expanding. And so that's really the focus of the question that I have is really about changing faculty culture. And so it's great to hear that going up in the promotion, you know, and promotion and tenure, that these kinds of projects are starting to get notice and credit, especially at a large university where, you know, the research requirements usually are very, very strict with regard to tenure and promotion. I guess I'm curious though, like what advice can you give or help us kind of think through in terms of changing departmental culture so that these kinds of projects or this kind of public facing work doesn't fall like squarely on the shoulders of A, junior faculty, and or B, all of the other faculty of, you know, who are underrepresented, who are usually taking on an enormous service, you know, burden for the department. I'm really curious, you know, to hear, like, you know, what kinds of conversations are departments having among their faculty to think about, okay, how do we transform ourselves? Because there's really, I mean, these projects are transformative, but they should be transforming the faculty too, in terms of helping us kind of completely reimagine what's the output for a history department? What's the output for an English department? What are we supposed to be really teaching the next generation of scholars to do? And that's where I often see like just a lot of resistance in getting, you know, mass faculty buy-in. I mean, I think every institution has their 5 or 6 public facing projects or interdisciplinary or whatever it is, champions, and every single one of us here can probably say, oh yeah, on my campus, these are the 5 people that you can go to, but how do you make that larger? So whoever wants to take that question.
I mean, I guess I could jump in quickly and say that I think what has been clear so far in our departments is that the faculty who participate in these labs become the evangelicals, right? They're the ones who are then arguing for their efficacy, their power, their the value, right? They're adding in multiple kinds of directions. For a department as large as ours, this can take a while. And you know, what I'm seeing is that even with 13 labs in 3 years, and even with the kinds of benefits, right, that you've seen with the student comments, and even with many of these same students telling us very explicitly, this project was a kind of X factor for me in multiple job markets, right? It made a difference. It made me stand out. I could, you know, go in and say, boom, here's a project that I did, you know, and be able to talk about it in very granular detail. We still have, you know, pockets of faculty, and these are, you know, kind of lefty faculty who, you know, care a lot, you know, about social justice issues, you know, who are very involved in DEI work, who still, at the end of the day, when they're sitting one-on-one with advisees in their office, say, I don't know, you know, about doing that lab next semester as opposed to writing a second research paper. You know, if you really want to succeed, if you really want to end up where I am, you know, you've got to be publishing, you've got to be doing the traditional kinds of things. And it is not easy, right, to push against that gravitational, you know, resistance to these kinds of culture changes. And so for us, I think we've accomplished a ton in 3 years, but it's ongoing, right? The culture change work continues. It does not stop at a particular moment. The other thing I just mentioned quickly is that, kind of to my surprise, the cohort of faculty that's been most engaged have been mid-career faculty, not the junior folks who are struggling to get books done, you know, so they can get tenure at Michigan, and not the very senior people who don't want to be bothered with retooling. It's kind of that middle group that have some degree of job security, but also are open to doing this and see it as a long-term benefit.
I mean, if I can just jump in and say one last thing from a different hat, which is my associate dean hat at the graduate school. basically I went from being DGS in history to moving into the graduate school, and it has helped enormously, I think, to have multiple places in the university having these conversations, putting these issues in front of the faculty, saying that these are priorities, and that, you know, so at the graduate school, we have been rolling out in the last year and a half a new vision for graduate education at Michigan, which is really built on many of these foundations, right? Where we want to insist that students are given professional and career development tools embedded in their graduate training, right? So that they have multiple options for what they do, and that it's their choice and their agency about what they do moving out after their PhD programs. There was one last question, I think. I don't know if we have time for it, but.
Yeah, I saw that, Sally, you lowered your hand, but if you want to keep put in a brief question, we're happy to take that.
Well, in a way, I think my question's been answered, but I'll ask it anyway. I wondered if you had thought about making this kind of graduate education interdisciplinary, so that working with the Holocaust Museum, for example, might entail a project or some sort of experiencing history module that would include social justice issues that relate to the Holocaust, for example, or you might also be interested in a women's studies connection to see if there's some gender issues that have not been explored. I can imagine it truly enriching the contribution to the museum, also the collaborative scope of what the graduate students experience and the faculty. I'm going later to present about an interdisciplinary graduate program that we're trying at Arizona State, and the faculty are loving working across all these different units. So I just wondered if that had come up in your conversations, but I'm hearing so much resistance, even with what you're doing. I'm sort of guessing the answer to this might be no, but I'd love to hear from you.
Rita, do you want me to take that from the partner standpoint, or
Sure.
do you want to?
Yeah, please do.
So one thing I would say that is in this course itself, while listed in the history department, we had, Rita, I'm trying to remember over the course of the 2 years, I think at least 3, maybe 4, maybe even 4 folks who were not in the history department, who were in literature or in area studies in some way. So the course itself, from Michigan's standpoint, was certainly not restricted to the history department. From the museum standpoint, we're actually always looking for interdisciplinary engagement. That's a big mark of success for us. And in fact, our next partnership, which is not going to happen for around 18 months as a result of some timing issues on both sides, has someone who's in gender studies and area studies, and her co-instructor is someone who's in literature. And that was actually something that was really exciting for us. We do have some parameters around what the project can and cannot do from a subject matter standpoint. There are, like, we can't, it is not the purview of this project to go into issues of contemporary genocide, because that's not the bounds that this specific project has. But there are others at the museum that do have that purview, right? So again, from the partner side, one of the things that this project did was really kind of introduce graduate students as not just viable partners, but potentially really important partners. Again, not only for this project, but across the institution more broadly. We're a giant institution with a lot of tentacles, and that had not really been entertained before. And I think that was a really important outcome. And I'll also say, it's kind of dovetailing off of the last question, that some of the outcomes that Rita and Jay don't necessarily see, but that we see as the partner, is we now consider ourselves resources for these students. And we have had, many of them have boomeranged back to us asking for informational interviews and thinking about who else can you connect me to. I just had a conversation last week. So now we're kind of getting into the, what kind of networks do we have at the museum that we can then offer out. So it's not, it's a very much a two-way exchange. And we're an institution that employs a lot of PhDs. My PhD was in literature long ago and far away. And that's another kind of reverberation of these types of projects.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for very insightful questions and for our presenters for sharing their work. You know, we know this is definitely not the end of this conversation. So thank you again, Dr. Chin, Dr. Cook, Dr. Wolfson, for your time and for sharing your really, truly fascinating work. We'll be taking our first break. It'll be about, well, now about 40 or so minutes, and we'll return at 2 o'clock for our first round of lightning talks. So the way that the sessions will work this afternoon, we'll have 4 lightning talks at a time in half-hour increments and with a 15-minute break in between. In the interim, feel free, like Jihan said in the chat, feel free to stay on and just turn off your mics and videos, or jump off and hop back on the Zoom at 2 o'clock or whenever you're available. In the meantime, feel free to join in with the collaborative notes from this session if you have lingering thoughts, comments, or questions, and also feel free to participate in the chat. Otherwise, we will see you all at 2 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you all.